morning, good afternoon, good evening, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants and distinguished experts. My name is David Wright, and I work for the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa based in New York. Today, we will convene a high-level policy conversation on ICT and higher education, lessons learned from the COVID-19 in Africa. This is a very important and very timely conversation in light of all the disruptions that we have all witnessed over the last year and a half towards 2 years due to this COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of times we hear discussions on how ICT is being used in basic education, but not so much emphasis has been placed on higher education. And so we have been able to gather these distinguished experts from the OSAA Knowledge Network, and they're going to discuss this issue in detail and give their recommendations and any advice they might have to member states as to how to better ICT in higher education, especially in this COVID-19 era. So I will quickly go over the bios of the distinguished experts. And then after that, I will follow through by asking questions to the experts. And then I will summarize the discussions at the end. So I will start by introducing Dr. Melesiu Dejeni Lema. He's an assistant professor of policy and development studies and journalism and communications at Hawassa University in Ethiopia. Dr. Lema is an International Vistas Leadership Program 2015 alumni in contemporary trends in higher education that he traveled to 5 US states and attended training in 13 universities, including Harvard and MIT. Dr. Lema is an academic, a researcher, a trainer, policy and media analyst, and has featured in numerous local and international media. He published in diverse areas of policy, food security, social protection, media, gender, and development. Dr. Lema is a member of professional networks, including UNITWIN, which is UNESCO's University Network for Gender, Media, and ICTs, and Canadian Association of African Studies. And he's also a member, as I said, of the UN OSAA Knowledge Network of African Experts. You're welcome, Professor Lema. I will now introduce Dr. Anne Siebert. She's a researcher and lecturer at the Institute of Development Research and Development Policy at the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany and at the South African German Center for Development Research at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. She is a social scientist and holds a joint PhD degree in International Development Studies from the IEE and the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. She has worked on options for poverty reduction, including urban agriculture, public nutrition, water supply, social protection, and public education. Dr. Siebert serves as a speaker for the German Association of Postgraduate Programs with special relevance to developing countries. You're most welcome, Dr. Siebert. The next distinguished expert on the panel today is Dr. Emeka Abioha. He is a full professor of sociology and a chair of research in the Faculty of Humanities and Law at Walter Sisulu University in South Africa. He holds a PhD degree from the University of Ibadan and a membership fellowship of 2 chartered institutes in management. Dr. Emeka is a distinguished scholar, a research laureate, a recipient of distinctive awards and international fellowships across continents. With this extensive expertise in development capabilities, social control, and systems equilibrium analysis, Dr. Emeka has consulted for some African governments and served international development agencies. He is a United Nations expert in social and development affairs and belongs to the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor, Knowledge Network of Experts. You're most welcome, Professor Emeka. Finally, our distinguished expert is Dr. Eliza, that's short for Elizabeth Ngutuku. She's a researcher at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa in the London School of Economics and Political Science. At FLIA, she is carrying out research on children and youth issues within processes of social change. She holds a PhD in development studies from the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Eliza is a scholar, activist with over 20 years of experience working on multi and post-disciplinary issues on children and youth development in Africa and Asia. As part of the movement aimed at decolonizing research in Africa, she has overseen research, mentorship in Elder Africa, an organization that mentors research leaders in Africa. Eliza is also a member of the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa Knowledge Network of Academic Experts. All right, so you're most welcome, Dr. Ngutuku. As you can see, we have a distinguished panel here. I will address the first question to Dr. Siebert, and if you don't mind, I'll call you by your first names. So, and the first question is to you. Higher education and related challenges are the focus of our conversation today. And this is also included in the policy brief that you and the other distinguished experts have worked on, have put together. Could you elaborate on why higher education requires further attention in debates on education in Africa? Over to you, Dr. Siebert.
Thank you, David Wright, for your kind introduction and the first question. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, many regions around the world were already confronted with diverse challenges in fulfilling the basic human right to education. So this is mirrored, for instance, in high dropout school rates and high illiteracy rates amongst adults. So hence it is evident that implementing the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which strives for quality education, remains challenging. So it is striking that sub-Saharan Africa presents the highest numbers in education exclusion. So for instance, according to the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, more than 1/5 of the children aged between 6 and 11 are not in school, as well as 1/3 of the youth between 12 and 14. So education exclusion also comprises a gender gap, with girls being more likely to not attend or drop out of school. And a so-called second education chance is often denied to children who work, marry, or have children early. But these are just some of the challenges we are facing. So without doubt, urgent action is needed to engage with these problems also in the face of an ever-growing young population in Africa. So our group of experts is strongly involved in higher education in different regions of Africa, and we agree that quality higher education is imperative for the continent's future. But unfortunately, we've also realized that debates on data and on education quality and access tend to focus mainly on children and young students, therefore on primary and secondary education. Still, and as highlighted in the continental education strategy for Africa, strengthening the linkages between education and the world of work, and thus to revitalize and expand higher education, is of key importance and requires further attention, particularly to address continental challenges and to promote global competitiveness, also to contribute to well-equipped societies and workforce. So solid tertiary education is key to train, for instance, highly qualified future managers, engineers, entrepreneurs, researchers, and decision makers in Africa. So in this context, it is key to contribute further to quality and relevance of diverse disciplines at African universities, create research capacities and establish networks between universities and research institutes on the continent, but also internationally. So it is so relevant to create more opportunities for excellent cutting-edge education in line with international standards. and simultaneously, ensuring inclusive and equitable access to higher education is essential for social justice and economic efficiency, an objective reflected in SDG Target 4.3. So it is clear that massive disruptions of the pandemic have exposed higher education systemic deficiencies. And let's be a bit more precise about the existing challenges here. Many of them have been existing actually for a long time. So in Africa, the number of higher education institutions remains lowest compared to other regions. Still, we can see explosive growth. So for instance, in the 1980s, we had a little less than 300 higher education institutions. And today we have around 2,000 universities. But of course, it's not enough to simply call for higher numbers of universities and graduates. We also need to engage with issues of quality, lacking financial resources, infrastructure, and human capital, speaking, for instance, about well-trained lecturers. All this requires further attention. Another critical aspect is the continent's research output, which is quite low. And according to the latest UNESCO science report published this year, Africa spends only about 1.6% of GDP on research and development, whereas the world average is around 1.8%. So clearly, reform and transformation are required in many ways. And finally, I would also like to briefly emphasize that the ongoing pandemic sheds light on tremendous shortcomings as well as opportunities, of course, comprising the use of information and communication technologies, so-called ICTs. And of course, we will talk about this in more detail. So this is my first answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Siebert. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown the need for more emphasis on higher education. As you said, there's need to build that capacity, so that you have graduates that are talented, that can compete, in the global arena. Thank you so much for that answer. I'll now turn to Professor Lema. I'll ask you your first question. Which issues and challenges in higher education became particularly visible during the pandemic? Over to you, Professor Lema.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright, and I'm also grateful to your esteemed office for creating such a platform that we can share our view to our leaders and policymakers. And I'm also grateful to your nice question. Yeah, as Professor Siebert first outlined, African higher education system and the whole environment, the higher education ecology has been impacted by, the COVID pandemic. And the pandemic, which was common for the global society, has actually introduced, a severe challenge to Africa. The first very reason.
Dr. Lema, sorry, could you put the microphone closer to your mouth? Thank you.
Yeah. Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, is lagging very much behind, as Professor Siebert, tried to put the context for us. If you see, for example, in terms of share, gross enrollment ratio in higher education in sub-Saharan Africa, according to recent statistics, is just below 10%. And while the global average you have is about 38%, and this actually indicates how Africa is, and especially sub-Saharan Africa is faring, lagging behind the world average. And the situation, as you suggested, has been complicated due to the arrival of the COVID pandemic, and most of which actually has to do with, digital infrastructure and ICT, which was already mentioned earlier. Africa has been, confined to usually the traditional face-to-face teaching modality due to the lack in infrastructure, and the pandemic introduced, another challenge here, because Africa has limitations in that regard, and Africa was not ready compared in relative terms compared to the rest of the world. Because if you see some statistics, for example, internet penetration rate in Africa, which is very important for ICT and digital infrastructure, is about 39% recently, and which is by far below the world average, which is at 59%. So the World Bank recent study estimated that African tertiary level is one of, the sectors which has been severely affected due to the pandemic. And the resort to, remote or virtual learning actually was a challenge for Africa for the reasons I mentioned earlier. For example, in order to add nuance to our discussion, I would like to outline some examples. For instance, if you see data from International Telecommunication Union, recent data I'm citing from 2015 onwards, if we see, for example, a 5-year data up to 2021, the fixed broadband coverage at global level kind of leaped from 11% to about 17%, while, if you see, the same issue with the developing world, where most of African countries belong to, is again low, which is, leaping from 7% approximately to 13%. And the issue will be, discouraging if you are, referring to the least developed countries, where, some of our, a significant number of sub-Saharan African countries are. If you see, for example, the development of the penetration from 2015, it grew from 0.8% in 2015 just at 1.4% penetration rate as of to date. And if you see again household internet access, which is again another important variable for, ICT and higher education, coverage and access issues, the developing world is again lagging behind, enjoying maybe just, if you say, just 36%, while, the rest of the world average is 59%. But least development countries like, Liberia and Niger and other in Central Africa, if you, for example, refer to, their coverage now is just 22%. Again, let me give you another variable, and, I can wind up, my answer to this question. That is, individual internet access, which is the most important variable for, ICT in higher education. If you see, the developing world now is about 33%, and the rest of the world average, for comparison for you, is 57%, and least developed countries are now at 27%. So, you can see here there is a great variation even within Africa. Africa in this sense is not a monolithic continent. Some part of Africa, especially the southern part of Africa, like South Africa, are relatively enjoying, a better internet access. And so does Egypt and Morocco, for instance. But, there is a very slow penetration in some countries, as I mentioned earlier, like Eritrea, Liberia, and Somalia. Therefore, Africa, if it should catch up with the rest of the world in terms of access to higher education, as Dr. Siebert already pointed out, there is a lot more to go in these terms. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lema. I think in your answer, you have really tried to show us the disparities in internet connectivity in Africa as opposed to other countries in the West. And clearly, if these African countries do not have adequate internet connectivity, that will affect their ability in higher education learning. You've given specific percentages. Internet penetration is on average 39% in Africa, while in the rest of the world, it's about 59%. But you also made it very clear that Africa is not to be seen as just one monolithic continent. It has different countries, and certain countries are faring better than others. You also said the ITU, that's the Inter-Telecommunications Union, the figures given there for fixed broadband level is just about 7% to 13% in African countries, where this broadband level is much higher in the West, reaching 17%. And also the individual internet access for African countries is only at 27%, while for the rest of the world, it reaches as much as 33%. So clearly, as you can see from the data that has been provided by Professor Lema, a lot of African countries are lacking in internet connectivity and internet penetration. And this certainly affects ability to learn, not only in higher education, but also in basic education. So thank you so much for that response, Professor Lema. I will now move to Professor Emeka. And the first question to you, sir, is based on the recent COVID-19 experiences, what spaces did ICT open in as far as learning is concerned in higher education in Africa? Over to you, Professor Emeka.
Thank you very much, David and colleagues. Well, taking a cue from the presentation from Dr. Lema and Sebert, it's crystal clear that African continent is obviously lagging behind when compared to other continents with regard to internet penetration. Well, the bubble busted actually during the time of COVID-19. That was actually a watershed moment in the history of internet usage in the world, particularly in Africa and the educational sector, especially. A lot of processes were affected and, in fact, severely hampered to the extent that operations hardly actually took off and the ground, and normal educational system and processes were in some places totally shut down, while in others maybe existed with some glitches. Well, one way in which higher education institutions in Africa responded to the abnormal situation was through introduction of or rolling out more access to information and communication technology in most areas of the institutional operation, where we used to have the contact and traditional face-to-face modality. So as it became impracticable for the face-to-face modality to continue due to the hard lockdown, it becomes more like what I would say blessing in disguise, even though we all acknowledge that COVID-19 was something that brought about a lot of challenges and predicaments. But at the flip coin of the whole situation is the realization and understanding of what COVID-19 actually has thrown up, the experiences that it has heralded, with regard to the ICT in the educational sector, higher educational sector in Africa. More importantly, we have to consider the fact that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the broadening of ICT usage in the higher education institutions, it actually opened up the space of the leaders in the higher institution, actually institutions understanding the prevailing learning environment, including the government. Because it appears that before then, there was this realization that things were not really right as far as educational system and internet penetration is concerned. But the reality really came up very, very obviously as a result of the pandemic? Well, it is also a stark reminder that Africa's internet penetration is still very low. Low, as Dr. Lima has mentioned, below the world average. So in that struggle, we see through the pandemic up to now that the most higher education institutions in the continent are actually struggling to cope with services to the students. Well, the reality we have presently is that there is lack of appropriate learning infrastructure and the state of unpreparedness within and in most higher education institutions in the continent. With the COVID-19 pandemic, it became obvious that our level of preparedness was quite low and the learning infrastructure were actually not up to what they should be. Considering the infusion of ICT into learning, during the pandemic, we will see that the use of ICT or the pandemic actually hastened or fostered, in one word, or accelerated the speed of move from the traditional delivery to technologically infused learning system. What I'm trying to say here is the fact that as a watershed moment in the history of learning in the continent, the COVID-19 pandemic era has actually doubled the speed, or if you like, it has accelerated the speed of transition from what we know and what we are used to doing now to the technologically infused teaching and learning. So it's more like, if you like, blessing in disguise, because we have to adapt to the new system. And in that situation, the condition has forced higher education institutions in the continent either to adapt quickly or to stall and risk the consequence of obsolescence. So it's literally forced the universities to recognize that the future is now and not even tomorrow, but now. It also highlighted the gap in access to learning devices, the gap that we have. It was just a moment that the universities realized that really the students and the learning communities are not really well equipped with the appropriate learning devices. In South Africa, for instance, the Ministry of Education made it a point of duty through what we called NSFAS. Is a funding arm of the government for students in the higher education institutions, the universities and TVET colleges. Well, there was a massive rollout of devices, laptops, tablets, and even the routers to students. But before then, yes, this was quite it was a normal practice in many universities, but it was something different, actually. It happened differently during the COVID-19 time because most universities actually have to go and look for their students in the rural areas and distributed laptops. So that shows that there was actually a gap, just alluding to what my colleagues have already mentioned, what Dr. Lima and Sebat has already mentioned, the level of lagging that we have in ICT, including the devices in this in this case. Well, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the response that came from the universities, one thing we have learned is the power of knowledge sharing. And we actually acknowledge the United Nations observation in this regard, that this is a time where the space has been open, or more space have been open for penetration of knowledge sharing through local, regional, and national broadcasting services. At the peak of the pandemic and the hard lockdown, a lot of experiments took place. And one thing we have to take home, or one thing we have to really be grateful to, is the fact that we developed new ways of sharing knowledge. In fact, knowledge sharing, the power in knowledge sharing was actually revealed at this point in time. And to the extent that it becomes something very valuable in higher education institutions and even all the educational sectors in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Emeka, for that very comprehensive answer. You have talked about the opportunities that one can actually take. When you're faced with a challenge, sometimes you do not just look at that challenge and give up, but instead you look at the challenge and you try and see what kind of opportunities that challenge can bring. And here you have said that African countries need to see this challenge of COVID-19 and look at the opportunity of how we can get ICT to be better integrated into higher learning to facilitate learning on the continent. So this is a very good and comprehensive answer. And you've also talked about the leadership in the academic institutions and how the leaders are now more galvanized and they now understand the priority of utilizing ICT in higher education. And because they are now mobilized, they are providing the necessary equipment that is necessary, including laptops, routers, and all the necessary equipment to facilitate learning using ICT. So thank you so much for that response, Professor Emeka. We will now turn to Professor Ngutuku. My question to you, dear Eliza, is from an African experience, were there any access and equity issues in ICT deployment in higher education? Over to you, please.
Thank you so much, David, for your question. And I'm going to be responding to that question from an equity and access perspective, but also building on what my colleagues have already talked about, the divides. But giving it an equity perspective, I want to say that on a larger scale, what happened is that the whole of the education systems in Africa were affected due to the closures and the move to online learning that was aimed at saving the academic year. But then we can say that learning and use of ICT itself revealed differences that we call intersectional, in the sense that it was not only differences that were across the board, but differences that were between the countries, differences that were between regions, differences and inequities between different universities. It also revealed rural and urban divides. But then online learning also revealed differences that were also gendered, in the sense that differently located male and female students were affected differently by the challenges that my colleagues have already talked about. And so we must always talk about who is left behind in terms of access and inequities, in as much as we talk about these global challenges that affected Africa. And I think my colleague, Dr. Melisu, has already talked about the digital divide that already mapped into existing vulnerabilities affecting both access and equity in learning, as well as in terms of also outcomes. But these inequities also affected specific learners, and we already talked about differences between countries, with many countries left behind compared to others based on what they had in terms of existing infrastructure. And I'm not going to go back to that particular statistics that is given us so well in terms of who was left behind. And I think my colleague, Dr. Emeka, has already talked about the issues of lack of digital facilities, access to computers, and with very low, access to computers, then some universities were not able to access them. But then we talk about equity. We have some universities, for example, he's talked about the universities in South Africa that are better endowed. So differences in terms of who could afford these particular devices to give to their learners. While some universities were able to afford this, other universities were not able to provide for their learners. So in terms of access, but also equities in terms of who has the capital and who has the capacity to provide for their learners. But then we also have examples in cases where even when these specific digital devices in form of tablets and also, smartphones were provided. Then we also had other challenges with learners saying that they were not able to use some of these facilities. So we can say on a larger scale, everybody else was not prepared, but even for those who are prepared, thinking that giving a digital device is going to solve the problem did not solve, because some of them said they could not be able to use them. And we've already talked about issues of access to data, and this is for Africa. But then we also know that there are also these stark differences in terms of regions, in terms of connectivity. We have some countries, like Kenya, which are much higher. Other countries, for example, like my colleague has already talked about, Eritrea, has already talked about, Burundi, and we also have Central African Republic, where the penetration of internet and digital equipment is very low. So these differences must be kept in mind when we're talking about who is not accessing internet, issues of low connectivity and bandwidth. So what happened is that some of the countries, in terms of access, did work with telecommunication companies to ensure that specific platforms were zero-rated. And this means that, learners could access these particular platforms without paying any money. And this in itself was a form of ensuring that they have access. But we must also remember that it is not everybody in Africa who was able to talk with telecommunication companies to be able to zero-rate platforms. And even when zero-rating platforms was done, and sometimes, internet bundles provided by specific universities, then we also had issues of learners also complaining that sometimes the data was only useful at night when everybody else is sleeping. You're supposed to interact, you're supposed to be active and awake when you're learning. We also had other issues of, some platforms, some forms of learning, for example, the asynchronous types of learning like video recording that themselves were not zero-rated. So then that also made it very difficult for some learners, even when everything else was put in place to ensure that they were benefiting adequately. So some could access, some were not able to access, but then them that made efforts, then there were also some challenges that also did linger. And these challenges were specific to specific universities. And the other issue of access is also issues of funding. It is supposed to be that the governments in Africa do provide for digital infrastructure, but the experience and our research does reveal that it was the responsibility of many of the universities to put in place, this digital infrastructure and modes of learning. And we know that universities themselves are at different starting points when it comes to ability to afford and ability to install very expensive infrastructure. So we also encounter this also divides also in terms of, for example, some private universities were almost well off compared to the public universities, because we all know sometimes they also are able to raise funds from students, and also compared to what the students in the public universities pay. So differences in terms of who was doing well based on whether they are able to afford. And then coming closer, many, even those ones who are able to access these devices and internet, and there was a problem, and this remains a big problem in Africa, the issue of digital fluency. The fact that you can access a device means that does not necessarily mean that you already have skills in navigating online learning. And the reason is because we know in Africa, these skills are not inculcated at a very early age in Africa. We don't have our learners start using computers, start using smartphones, from a very early age. And this is something that disadvantages Africa when you talk about inequity. So then this in itself made it very difficult. But then that also means that it is not only the learners that were disadvantaged also, but because the teachers and the trainers themselves are also disadvantaged, then this also manifested itself into the learning that was already occurring and these inequities. And for example, some teachers were already reported to just be posting their notes online, forgetting that actually learning is also pedagogical. It is the interaction. And that on itself has got this access and inequity issues compared maybe to universities that already had their teachers already trained in the use of ICT. And as I also finish on the issues of equity and access, we know very well that the problem of ableism, who is able, really affects our countries in Africa, and around issues of a one-size-fits-all education system sometimes that does not cater for students and learners with disability. So we were thrust, as my colleague Professor Emeka has said, into this arena that teachers had to do something to save the academic year, and that meant in specific ways that some people who are learners with disabilities had to be left behind. And this on its own deepened the inequalities and inequities in education. And of course, we had some universities that were well endowed, that were able to have separate platforms for learners with disabilities. Some of them were able to have like assistive technologies. Some of them were able maybe to have this content in Braille, especially the ones that got a history of this blended and online learning. But for others, this was not actually possible. So learners with disabilities reported that they were disadvantaged. Some of them reported that they were not maybe able even to complete their assignments, but also in very specific ways, some of them noted that they had to really recite their disabilities to the lecturers for them to qualify for maybe extra time, for them to really feel that they deserve. And when you talk about disabilities, these are not good things when you have really to recite your disability to everybody. And to finish, in terms of gender differences, and we cannot overemphasize this, we had also specifically the female learners also more disadvantaged. And it was not only the female learners, but specific learners who are from low socio-economic backgrounds, because they did not have probably a good space to learn. And many of them, according to the research that we engaged with, reported that they were already exhausted by caring for the family, by also caring for the sick relatives, by the care burden of housework. That maybe did not affect, male students in a similar way. But also when you talk about also differences in terms of the ones that were already in the rural areas were more affected. But also those students, the learners that were already in the universities, even though the universities were closed, the ones that were in the residences were not as affected. So yes, gender differences, but also these small nuances of who was left behind in terms of gendered differences. But then as I finish, it also opened spaces, and I want to just give an equity angle to what my colleague, Professor Emeka, has said. It also did open specific spaces for us to be able to see what we need to do in terms of ensuring equity. For example, some of the managers said that the fact that they were able to follow up with some of the learners from very low socioeconomic backgrounds, for example, when they were giving them the videos, recorded videos, and the way they were able to see some of the issues that these learners go through, they said, moving forward, even if we are going to go back to the traditional brick and mortar university, we cannot unsee these specific differences. We cannot fail to recognize and acknowledge that our learners are not on the same starting point. And that is a very positive space that have been opened for the managers to be able to see learners are different, and moving forward, we are going to be able to provide differently and to put in place different and diverse pedagogical practices that are going to ensure that nobody is left behind. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Eliza, for such a very comprehensive answer. I don't even think there's a follow-up question to that one. But indeed, you have really spoken about the African experience and the disparities in equity after this COVID-19 pandemic, was revealed on the continent. You showed the inequity from countries on the continent, inequities by regions on the continent, even inequities by the universities in a specific country. So there's so much inequity based on gender. Women are more affected by the pandemic when it comes to their learning. Also, the socioeconomic class, the poorer people tend to be more disproportionately affected. And then you also went and discussed how the children or learners with disability are the most vulnerable when it comes to learning during this situation. So we need to address the issue of equity when it comes to higher education. Thank you so much for that very comprehensive response. I see that the moderator, Mr. Sinani, has joined us. Mr. Sinani, we have asked the first round of questions. You can proceed with the second round of questions. Mr. Sinani?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry for the problem of connection, but it's strange. Anyway, I managed with the various tentatives. Now I'm with you.
Yes,
sorry for that.
Could you proceed with the second set of questions?
You mean the second round of question, which is just brief me a little bit so that I can proceed properly.
Okay, all right. Let me ask the second question. The second question now goes to Dr. Siebert. Dr. Siebert, to follow up on what you have mentioned, what are some possibilities to bridge the gap and to allow for a smooth transition from secondary to higher education?
Thank you very much, David, for the second question. Yeah, certainly one key aspect is recognizing the importance and relevance of higher education in diverse ways and on various levels as highlighted. Yeah, so this kind of recognition needs to be in line with SDG 4, particularly target 4.3, which calls for equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university by 2030. And yeah, more recently, the Global Education Coalition emphasized support for technical and vocational education and training, adult learning and literacy, and higher education in Africa as one of its key fields of action. So I think the big and often neglected question here is how this support should look like, and therefore how to promote a smooth transition from secondary to higher education. And I would definitely like to see more reports and policy papers focusing on this, as this is evident that much has to be done here. But let me summarize some aspects. So it has to be highlighted that expansion of tertiary education has been unprecedented and accompanied by persistent vertical and horizontal inequity. So the vertical dimension refers to those who enter and those who graduate. So even when they gain access, students from underrepresented and disadvantaged groups tend to have lower completion rates. So this also refers a bit to what Eliza or Dr. Eliza already mentioned. And yeah, so one has to keep in mind that many of them only have limited information on higher education, as for instance, no one in their family holds an academic degree. So it is evident that enrollment and completion of studies are more likely for children of more educated parents. So much has to be done to attract a wider range of young people and to support them in their academic journey. So part of it are differentiated tuition pricing and targeted student aid. And more broadly, consultation in various ways is required. And yeah, ideally schools would start early to provide young people with insights and a feeling about existing higher education opportunities. And part of it could be, for instance, open days at the universities. So it could be an asset to invite prospective students onto campus to take a look around. And visitors could be able to meet the staff and the current students and to find out more about different study programs, for instance. But also forging robust inter-institutional collaborations, building strong linkages between schools and universities helps to ensure a smooth transition from secondary to higher education. And in addition, information campaigns as well as detailed information on universities' website are so much needed, which also refers to kind of solid marketing activities and helps in building linkages to the job market. And I think it is also evident that alumni could play a key role in attracting prospective students and creating networks with the employment market. This would also contribute to the horizontal dimension, which concerns this kind of institutions attended and the labor market opportunities that various qualifications and degrees offer graduates. And beyond the issues of access to and the completion of higher education, poor technical conditions, including restricted access to ICTs, remain limiting factors for a smooth transition from secondary to post-secondary education. I think to some extent this already became clear in these answers provided by my colleagues. So it is of utmost importance to continually upgrade this kind of infrastructure and to meet the changing demands of 21st century higher education. So these are just some of the examples which I would like to highlight here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siebert. In the interest of time, if we can keep the responses as short and succinct as possible so that we do not exceed the time that's allocated to us. I will now ask the next question to Professor Lema. Your second question, sir. Coming back to the points that you mentioned, what could be done by policymakers, civil society, donor organizations, or other actors to overcome these challenges, the challenges that you mentioned in your first response?
Thank you, David. I think I would like to attack this important question from three layers: from a policy perspective, and the other from infrastructural perspective and skills perspective. These issues have been discussed by my distinguished colleagues, Dr. Eliza and Professor Emeka, and as well Dr. Siebert, who outlined these three layers should come together if Africa should catch up with the digital literacy and advance its higher education system. The blessing in disguise, which was mentioned very interestingly by Professor Emeka, can be exploited if policymakers are brave enough to make conducive policy environment. That conducive policy environment, actually I will make myself brief for the interest of time, David, should include, for example, incentive for investors who are going to come up with digital investment or investment in infrastructure. So, policymakers need to know now that, and Africa in general should understand that ICT is no more a luxury. And the COVID pandemic has taught us seriously and hard that now ICT has become a kind of basic requirement for our educational delivery in terms of quality, in terms of other issues which might be discussed later by Professor Emeka, I guess. So policymakers, should level the ground for, a kind of appropriate environment and situation for digital investment. And other actors, for instance, that you mentioned in the question, like civil society, can help African governments, for instance, as education is a human right. And when we say education is a human right, and if we are, striving to achieve SDG 4 later, at the end of the day, investing in this is not an option. Therefore, civil society should advocate, for other stakeholders to, jump in, to come in and invest in this very important infrastructure. The other actors I should mention here are the donor organizations or development partners who should support African governments and policymakers in their investment on digital literacy. For the short term, it might not be easy for Africa, to catch up with the rest of the world and to meet the SDGs, which I see, sometimes very ambitious, So in order to catch up, different stakeholders should put hands together, including the donor organizations and partners. Where can they help is one, in terms of the infrastructure, and the other in training and capacity enhancement, where, the third important layer I mentioned at the outset, the skill aspect, could come in here. So, the issue of digital literacy and lagging behind in that respect, which was pointed out by Dr. Eliza, earlier, can be actually narrowed down if these different stakeholders are coming together. And lastly, but not least, learners, African students and the African citizens like, ourselves should come up with a sort of motivation to harness, and exploit the opportunities which are, induced by the COVID pandemic. The digital divide is not only infrastructural, it is a skill aspect. And a skill, needs learning. And learning, as you know, is something which comes up from an internal drive or motivation. So Africa, its citizens should be motivated enough in order to catch up with the rest of the world and in order to actually enhance in terms of skill requirement. So over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Lemma. Indeed, Africa needs support. We need support, as you said, from the learners themselves. They should see this as an opportunity for them to get more motivated to learn. We need support from CSOs who will galvanize different partners to invest in ICT. And we also need support from the donor community and from international organizations to support Africa in building the infrastructure for ICT and for higher learning. So thank you so much for that response. I'll now move on to Professor Emeka. Your second question, sir. How well did the deployment of ICTs help in achieving learning and schooling outcomes during the pandemic? And related to this, can you reflect on some of the quality issues that emerged during the deployment of ICT in learning? Could you be as brief as possible, please? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. Indeed, having alluded to the various opportunities that the pandemic actually heralded with regard to the ICT penetration and deployment. At this point, we have to think about how the extent to which this deployment has achieved the desired learning outcomes. And I'm going to respond to this, address this, looking at the input-output, that is sustainability of the institutions, in terms of returning students, the quality issues, and then the integrity issues. Well, with regard to the input, we look at the student enrollment target, and which is actually the one of pivotal structures of a university sustenance. During the pandemic, yes, the deployment of ICT was the reality and was what actually saved the situation and ensured the continuity. But I want to say at this point that it did not really go all that very well. It was more like a paradoxical situation, even though we had no choice. Higher education institutions in the continent and all over the world had no choice than to deploy the ICT massively. With that ICT, a lot of students actually could not register in terms of those continuing, and the fresh entrants could not come on board because of the difficulties. Sometimes most times there were glitches, and in other times they were completely stalled. So in that, the most higher education institutions in the continent witnessed a kind of a sharp decline in the student enrollment target, continuing students and fresh entrants. Well, with regard to the pass rate and throughput, it's actually evident that the deployment of ICT, well, with much anticipation and much hope that it will salvage the situation, did just, well, very little. The only thing there was that there was no other choice to fall back to. But the anticipation was that everything will just go very smoothly, but that opposite was the case. Pass rates, when we look at pictures and what actually came out from the continent in 2020 and earlier in 2021, we could see vividly that student pass rates dropped, even in national examinations like matric in South Africa, in Rwanda. You know, there was real decline in pass rate. And with regard to throughput, that is the number of students who entered and are coming out successfully, we could see from all over the continent, especially in less resourced countries, that there was massive dropout, not by choice, but as a result of inability to cope with the ICT situation. A lot of students and the families could not cope with the demands of the ICT, even though the ICT was deployed to be the to save the situation. However, it paradoxically created some other kinds of anxieties, created other kind of frustrations to families. And this actually relates to what we've discussed before with regard to the lag that sub-Saharan Africa especially, and the whole continent has with regard to the internet penetration. Then with regard to the quality issues, yes, I may declare upfront here that the use of ICT in learning and teaching during the pandemic era did not really meet the expected target in terms of quality of delivery. More importantly, this shift did not come without compromises. There was actually absolute compromises in terms of learning successes assumed to be in place, and learning successes are assumed to be delivered. To the extent that the surveys and experience from students tend to point to the fact that students did not actually have a complete feel of achievement. You know, when we speak about quality, we speak about, you know, the kind of feel, the kind of substance that students have received, and the kind of assurance that they have. But most students did not really exhibit that assurance and feel of achievement. What happened in most situations, students could not actually learn properly with the ICT. And for that reason, they could not really have that particular, you know, kind of achievement that's supposed to be in place after that learning. There was complete, or I don't want to use the word, there was near loss of interactive learning. Even the deployment of ICT came with it some modalities and some, you know, interfaces that the ICT experts tried to put in place, but that by no means, those by no means were not any replacement for the interactive learning. So interactive learning was lost, and we all know that that translated to loss of learning quality, because the classroom debates that we used to know was totally off the window. And the feel, the psychological feel that usually come with the physical classes and the kind of the essence of the warmth were completely lost. Procedurally, we discovered that in most continents, in most countries in Africa, the higher institutions in those countries, especially the ones that are lower income, not South Africa, particularly because South Africa tried to put through the situation because of availability of some resources. But if we'll consider the lower income countries, what we really saw there was the fact that there was this loss of sequence of teaching and assessment. There was kind of a blurredness between the processes of teaching and assessment, to the extent that students felt that, just like what Dr. Eliza mentioned, some lecturers, because of lack of knowledge on how to really deal with or how to use the ICT, were just posting their lecture notes without the necessary know-how to deliver these quality teaching. So the students, most of the students were actually lost in the whole system, in the whole learning management system. Then coming to the assessment content in most cases became very, very poor, to the extent that what students used to, like the critical thinking writings and others, were lost because the available learning management systems in most higher education institutions were mainly adapted to multiple choice questions, objective questions, and filling the gap and all that. So there were not these demands for critical reasoning and reflections that we usually have in the brick and mortar face-to-face education system. So that really helps on the quality of content of the assessment. Then if we really consider what is actually being said, we discover that because of the fact that most educators themselves were not having the kind of knowledge they should have, so there were kind of mix-up in the assessment issues, and there were lack of standardized modalities. There were not modalities that are standardized across countries. For instance, what we found at that time was a lack of definite standard that leaves individual faculties, departments, and sometimes lecturers to determine the assessment modalities to be used, because everybody was thrown into the bubble, and people do, and it was like you do what you can do to get the students through. And there was this lack of unpreparedness. There was no standard modalities across universities, across TVET colleges. So even in specific universities, it was difficult actually to regulate this because we were not then ready for that. Well, integrity is part and parcel of quality. At this point, I will want to say that the integrity of the educational system, the assessment, more importantly, was highly challenged. It was really challenged in the sense that it remained a huge concern in many higher educational institutions. The research and what we have actually found from the continent across countries, specifically what we have read about South Africa, tend to point to the fact that there was academic dishonesty. There was widespread academic dishonesty by students during examinations. This was reported very widely, and because there were what we call lack of invigilation and monitoring. And for that, the students were copying, and there was disregard to intellectual property. So those are real huge concerns, the integrity. Even though I want to say that ICT was a saving grace, it was something that came very handy. It was something that was really put in place by higher education institutions, leaderships, and even ministers in order to get something going. However, it came with its own cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. So we don't have much time. We only have 9 more minutes left. The last question will then go to Professor Ingutuku. What do these access and equity issues tell us about ICT governance in higher education in Africa? If you can be as brief as possible, please, and then we'll pass the floor over to Mr. Sinane to just give his concluding remarks. Thank you, Eliza, over to you.
Yes, thank you, David. And I'm going to be as brief as I can because most of the issues have been shared by my colleagues. The move to online learning itself revealed ICT and governance issues that were already extant in the context of higher education and learning in Africa. And for example, we've already talked about, most of the universities in Africa did not have ICT policies, and they also lacked a clear policy direction on the use of ICT in higher education. We've already talked about, these are the policies for blended learning, as well as standards and accreditation. So for example, what my colleague, Professor Emeka, has talked about, low quality of learning itself also reveals the problems that are part of the system, but not necessarily the learners themselves. Many countries don't have these particular policies. And the second and the last one I want to bring across is that, and I've already talked about it, is the lack of, funding, lack of investments in infrastructure in Africa. And most of the ICT interventions in higher learning are already funded by the donors. And we already know that these donors themselves have already been affected by the pandemic itself. And so these processes are already also sometimes uncoordinated, and then they do not also include commissions of higher education in Africa. So coupled with lack of policy, lack of policy direction, but also lack of investment in ICT and in learning and direction whatsoever, I would summarize this as key ICT governance issues that are affecting higher learning in Africa. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eliza, for being so brief. We have been joined by Mr. Sinani. Mr. Sinani is currently working at the UNESCO office in Dakar, Senegal. He is the West African Cluster Lead for Planning and Regional Coordination on the implementation of SDG 4 for education in Africa. Mr. Sinani, I know that you joined rather late. We will not ask any more questions at this point because we only have about 6 minutes left. So if you want, you could just give us any brief update on the work that is being done by UNESCO in the implementation of SDG 4. And if you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to offer. Over to you, Mr. Sinani.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. And thanks, eminent colleagues and professors. What I would like to say at this point of time is that education technology generates passionate debate. So this one that we have here in higher education and ICTs. So with regard to where we stand on SDG 4, I will say SDG 4 and the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, because we are working in Africa, so the challenge here is just to monitor the two global agenda. There will be an important report that will be issued beginning of next year at the Forum of Sustainable Development in Kigali, giving us a sort of a situation at stake on these two global agenda. The one is SDG 4 education, the other one on CSR, as a sort of baseline with the thematic focus on equity. And I understand from the discussion here is that there is a clear technology, the role of technology is there, and there is is evolving at a breakneck speed, so that those who lead technological development are always a step ahead of those who can provide reflection and evaluation on their application and negative consequences, and those who need to take relevant decision on legislation, policy, and regulations. So there will be a takeaway for policymakers and from this discussion. And I think that the brief note that is coming from professors and for colleagues who are discussing today, they will give us a sort of good reflection on how well technology in education can be more relevant for higher education in Africa. The second point I would like to highlight is there are great expectations for technology in SDG 4. And what I catch up from from panelists, they refer to SDG 4 as well. It means that all achievement of SDG 4 is depend on opportunity and challenges posed by technology. And this is one thing that can be applied from the whole level of education. And just to highlight again that you remember the Aiken Declaration was explicit on technology. The Education 2013 framework for action call on education system to be relevant and respond to the to technological advances as well. There is also another thing that I would like related to SDG 4, is that selected SDG 4 target refer to technology. So all this to say that we are in the right, we are in the subject matters. And my last point will be a sort of a takeaway for decision makers. What education problem can technology address? I think that all panelists explained this well. You take into consideration, let's say you talk about access, you talk about equity, you talk about, let's say, inclusion, but I think also there is an issue of quality. Professor Emeke based this well, mainly how can education system provide the new skills that the technology demands. This is an important task that we need maybe to achieve. There is also the question related to the technology development as such, because how can education system support technological development? This is an issue that we have. Africa is not unique. Africa, we cannot design a sort of one size fits all for all countries. Countries are different. There are many perspectives differently in one way to another. There are countries that are advanced in this area. I believe that South Africa, where Professor Emeka is working, and there are other parts that they are very, very far from where we can imagine. So this is an issue. There is an issue of, I think, the system management as such, because how can assessment, other education management data be more relevant and widely used? And probably before going to other, my very last point, I think there is a need for cooperation among African countries, a sort of support within the agenda of African Union, so that we can have a sort of conditions that need to be met for technology to support education in learning from one country to another. This is the only way that I see that technology will support education. For sure, there are some conditions. Conditions are access to technology. This is an issue. There is an issue that I think that one of the panelists highlights very well, is governance and regulation. How can education system protect learner from the risk of technology? And then there is a very last issue, that this the issue of teacher preparation. Because how can education system support all teachers to teach, use, and deal with technology effectively? This is a very, very challenging. So this is to say that many things have been done. There are countries which are in different steps in this regard. And there are countries that can help others to provide, let's say, a substantive feedback on some area. And even though recommend potential area from where we can draw, we can already establish, let's say, some knowledge, not to start from the scratch, but how can I say that? That learn from others. So responses to all these questions, I think, require, let's say, collaboration among countries, require research, I think, in the academic way, and require also discussion within the platform of African Union, so that we can be, let's say, more in the right track, so to have successful technology policy and program that can help African to strengthen education system, and also to address some of the critical issues or some of the critical problems that most of the country are facing. The pandemic has alerted all of us that we have to take action on that, but I think this is the way that we can help, we can sustain, we can prepare future generation of Africans to be more in the new, let's say, the new world environment we are living with it, which is totally dominated by digital and technology that affect the education as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinane, for such a very comprehensive summary of what has been discussed today. I would also like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank these distinguished experts that are part of the OSAA Knowledge Network under Cluster 3, which addresses issues relevant to social protection. And education and ICT in higher education is one area that has been identified as an area that needs more attention. It needs more funding. It needs more technology, internet penetration to facilitate learning in the higher education, so that we have the capacity to be able to compete globally. And so that we have the capacity, we have engineers, we have teachers, we are able to train the youth of the continent so that they are better able to sustain economic development on the continent. A lot has been said. I will not go into further detail now because I think we have said a lot, and a lot of the summary has already been given by Mr. Sinani. So thank you so much, Professor Emeka Abioha. Thank you so much, Dr. Ann Siebert. Thank you so much, Dr. Eliza Ingutuku. And thank you so much, Professor Melisiu Dijeni Lema. Your contributions have been very valuable, and my hope is that this information will reach the stakeholders that need to hear what you are saying, because you're bringing the perspective of the academia from Africa, and you're bringing it to the United Nations. So we've created this platform to hear you speak, and you've spoken clearly and loudly. And so we'll use this information as we work with member states in advising them on ICT and higher education in Africa in this COVID-19 era. I thank you all so much, and I adjourn this meeting. Thank you and bye-bye.